Hello, welcome everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces, but just in case, for those who are not very familiar with us, I would like to start by briefly explaining CRIC. CRIC is a research-based critical initiative for people and topics in the cracks, mostly doing online screenings and events. By choosing CRIC as the name of our initiative, we embrace and reclaim the multiple meanings of this versatile word in Turkish, such as crack, broken, hue, hybrid, fault, strange, queer, and bent. This is the second year of CRIC, and in the founding year, we have focused on discussions of radical solidarity, where we have hosted online talks and screenings. Recently, under solidarity discussions emerged two specific sub-themes. One of them was sanctions and boycotts. And so far, we have hosted 3 closed by invitation only discussions, as the topic is very sensitive. Our second series is on culture wars and cultural hegemony. And our guest today, Rijin Sahakian's talk titled "You Don't Make It Public," is actually a bridge between these two sub-themes I have mentioned earlier. Rijin will be talking on how artist-led boycotts in recent years have focused on the plausible deniability of curators, debates over degrees of political culpability, and/or the limits of representation. Also, how these questions often obfuscate and bypass the mechanisms by which cultural productions are and are not supported long before exhibitions are planned or open for display. Welcome, Rijin. And Rijin uses writing, teaching, and art making to examine critically the relationship of contemporary art and culture to coalition wars in Iraq. She founded SADA, an arts education initiative for Baghdad-based students operating from 2010 to 2015. Rijin also curated many exhibitions around the world, and she has taught at California Institute of the Arts. She published her writings in Warscapes, eFlux Journal, N+1, Hyperallergic, Camera Austria, The Derivative, and Art Forum. She most recently created an anthology film with former members of SADA for Documenta 15. Without further ado, I leave the Zoom floor to Rijin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to be a part of this program in particular. I will start with an overview of the work that I and several of the artists that were involved in some of the experiences that I'll be discussing were how we started to work together and sort of the context of working together and where we were. And I'm going to share some images with that. So I'll start. I'm just going to share my screen here. Oh, here we go. Okay. So a lot of this work and unfortunately the kind of withdrawals or protest work that I have been involved in, and with several of the artists who I worked with during the time of SADA initially. That has been the case for many reasons. And so this is why I want to go back to 2010 in Baghdad, which is where we started SADA. And this is a picture of the art school at the Baghdad University College of Art. So this is the picture from the outside. And I want to start with this just to sort of give a sense of what was happening in the city during this time. So this is 2010, 7 years after the invasion, and 17 years after the first Gulf War, coalition war against Iraq. And these concrete walls, the blast walls that you can see, are in front of the College of Art, but they were also on almost every single street in the city at the time. So although it was 7 years after the initial invasion, the city was still very much a militarized space. You see that at the college, and just beyond the frame of the picture is a military checkpoint, which is also on nearly every intersection and entrance throughout the city at this time. So the invasion really led to this ongoing militarization, which didn't see a kind of end point in the years after the invasion or with the official end date of the invasion either, but really led to this kind of the sort of breaking up of the city, but also a visual reminder in every sense that control was being set up physically through these kinds of barriers, and with the reminder that violence was spontaneous, could happen at any moment, and that the checkpoints and the concrete walls were there and implemented to sort of control the movement of people as well. So if you wanted to cross the street, if you needed to get home, if you know, the kind of traffic that this started or put into the city, you know, traffic at this point wasn't just taking an extra hour or so to get home, but was also part of the psychology of the city, in which being in your car or being in the city was this hyper sort of stressful space because of the car bombings, attacks by soldiers, the kind of random violence that could take place at any moment. And this relates to something a bit later that I'll discuss when I bring up the MoMA PS1 exhibition on the Iraq Wars. But the College of Art at Jamiat Baghdad, which is the University of Baghdad, is a multi-decade institution, started in the 50s and has had an ongoing program. Also, because this is part of the country's infrastructure, educational infrastructure, art school is free. But some of the issues with the art school are that because of the sanctions and the wars, it has really been a very stagnant place where there haven't been, development of curriculums or the ability to replace professors, many of whom left or were targeted, not just in the 90s, but particularly after 2003. So it has been very difficult. It's difficult to sort of call it an art school in the way that other art schools have been able to sort of continue to develop. And that's not just the art school per se, that is across so much of the infrastructure in Iraq. But because we're talking about the art school, I have to point this out specifically and as part of the reason for starting SEDA. So this was part of my initial trips to Baghdad and to the art schools to meet with artists and to find out if there was interest or a need for a kind of alternative space for art making to take place, to have workshops together, to have a sort of different space for artists to come together and to access other artists who were working in different areas, and to be able to practice and do critiques and explore together. And through these conversations and through these visits, there was an interest, there was a need, partially because of the extreme isolation that the war and the invasion developed in Iraq. And this is another image that I took during one of these initial visits. I should say I was in a fortunate, in a way, position because of being born in the country. I was able to go back without any special visas or paperwork that I needed to do. So I had kind of a way to go that maybe would have been difficult otherwise. But because of this, I was able to go, and this is flying in from Amman to Baghdad. And I bring up this picture just below the bar here. You can see a kind of aerostat blimp. So the airport is below. On the left of the screen, there's a large building on the water that is Al-Fa Palace. That was one of the former regime's palaces, in which became one of the main American bases, military bases during the invasion. And so it's just near the airport, and was a central site along with the green zone for the implementation of the occupation. And this aerostat blimp up top. So I took this picture from the window of the plane, and I was very interested in what this machine was in the sky. And when I landed, I asked family member that I was with, what is this? What is that blimp in the sky? And he told me that he laughed and said, "It's the Americans. They're taking pictures of us." He is right. This is a satellite plane where they do imaging over the city. And there are a number of these that are placed above the air bases, but in central areas of Baghdad where they can survey what is below. So there are these, the occupation really is of course, all wars are experiments and a kind of research process. And this is sort of just a brief snapshot of some of the totality, where you have the checkpoints, blast walls, and the green zone in the center of the city on the ground, and these permanent installations in the sky. And you understand as a resident in the city that you are being watched and surveyed, and that there is this kind of control over the skies and on the ground as well. So there's this totality of the occupation. This piece is one that was done with one of the artists from Sada, and an artist who was involved in the subsequent exhibition. His name is Sajjad Abbas. This was done in 2013. And I should point out first that this building faces part of the green zone. And so on the building, this is one of the larger buildings. Across this river is the green zone, where the American and coalition occupation was centered, physically centered, where the US Embassy, the $7 billion US Embassy, was established, a number of other corporate and government offices, and takes up space where the former regime's space was. So, but it also is barricaded all around. So it's in the center of the city. You can't really drive through without seeing it, but everyone understands that it is off limits. You cannot get to it, but you can see it. You could see the green zone. You could see the American Embassy even from the freeway, from the road that goes over it, but you could not access it at this point. They opened it up a couple of years ago for people to be able to access. If you want to apply for a visa or have work that you need to do there. But for many, many years, and particularly in the worst violence of the occupation and invasion, it was this very massive, visible reminder in the middle of the city that this is where control is being centered, and was this language that comes in with the green zone, safety, protection, air conditioning, water, clean water, all of these really vital resources and ability, sort of power is being centered and isolated within a street, across a street, and the outside, what they term the red zone, where in the height of the violence under the occupation, up to 7,000 Iraqis a day were being killed. So this picture, is of the installation that Sajjad Abbas did. He was a teenager at the time in 2013. And he basically scaled this building, which is called the Turkish building, actually, because there used to be a Turkish restaurant in the building, a very well-known one. Scaled it and put up the writing, Agdar Shufik, I can see you, and an outline of his own eye. So this was this height of the building facing this sort of central power, and to have this kind of way of grabbing at agency and saying, we know what you're doing, and we can see it, and we know it, and we're not just sort of abiding by it. And this is really an incredibly important piece, not only because it's sort of taking something into your own, taking this agency upon yourself, but also because at the time, and maybe since, there hasn't been, you know, with all of the saturation of media and writing around, here we go. Sorry, I'm just going to share this again. With all of the saturation around it, there was not ever a, sorry about this. There wasn't a sense of what Iraqis themselves were experiencing, or their own sort of power and thoughts and resistance to the occupation and to the invasion. And that was a really difficult thing to see for many people, but also this idea that there wasn't this kind of feeling amongst Iraqis, or that there wasn't a visible sort of resistance. The only one eventually would be called insurgency, which is another way of attributing violence and you know, a kind of violent nature to Iraqis, so many of whom were resisting in many, many ways, and not simply through what would be termed insurgency. So this was the piece that Sajjad did. He did need to take it down after several days when officials understood that this was up, and he had done it independently. This is just an overview of the green zone, just to have a sense of the scale of it. This is the river. The large building here is part of the embassy, and just you can see the scale of the green zone here. And this is just the US Embassy compound. So that 104 acres is only one building and one compound in the entirety of the green zone. So the scale is really immense. And to imagine what it's like to be in the city and have this kind of extreme violence in every part of it, and then to look across the river and to see this kind of calm, serene space is very jarring, but also very obviously says a lot about the situation at the time, but also says a lot about how things are being discussed now in a global way, where the terminology of the green zone and the red zone has now become part of the climate change terminology, where in many articles, you know, even, you know, mainstream articles like in the New York Times, discussion around climate change is talked about in terms of red zones, where nations will become very, very affected. And Iraq is one of those nations that is, I think, you know, 4th on the endangered countries list, or ones that will be most affected by climate change, and green zones, places where there will be a kind of climate refuge, or surviving the kind of effects of climate change around us. So that language is something that has become very normalized, and part of this kind of idea of what spaces and geographies and people will be inhabitable places and uninhabitable places, or able to be, you know, already assigned sort of unable to survive. This is the Turkish building. So the Sajjad's piece was in 2013. This is the same building from a view behind it during the 2019 uprisings in Iraq, which were nationwide, youth-led, a massive and really incredible grassroots movement throughout the country, particularly in the south, and also in central Iraq. So you can see here the bridge. So that was the bridge across to the green zone. So you can really see how it is both visible and able to be made inaccessible. In 2019, this movement, the sort of major saying that came out of it was, "We demand a homeland." So we demand these, what we deserve, which is, you know, a country where there is employment, there isn't this deep corruption, this inability to, you know, survive in the way that people, particularly young people, deserve. Iraq has one of the youngest populations on the planet. A huge percentage of its population is under the age of 30. And so you really saw this in the protests, where a majority of the people who were organizing and leading the protests were youth. You know, the crackdown was also extremely brutal, where more than 1,000 protesters were killed by state and paramilitary. And the majority of those people who were killed were under the age of 25. But at this time in 2019, there were several movements prior as well, and continue to be this kind of resistance to what took hold in Iraq. They took on the Turkish building as a kind of symbolic space to hold the protests. So 2013 is when Sajjad put this up, and in 2019 we have this mass takeover of the building itself, this abandoned building, and was at once a space where people set up libraries, gathering spaces. It was a strategic point where on the roof they could call down to protesters on the ground. If you could see the bridge, there was military above, you know, forward from the protesters, sort of calling out and trying to support the protesters on the ground. So it had this very strategic and symbolic meaning, and really became this important site for the protests, for the symbolism of it, and also what they were standing up against, which is this immense wealth and power. Because even after the official pulling out of the invasion, the government and all of these corporate office buildings are still at that site. So it still has this really important, it's a very important space, and one where they were attempting to breach. So this is from the top of the building, where you can see the protesters on the ground, and the military on the other side attempting to suppress it. So this is just a side-by-side of the piece, and then the protesters, Sajjad's piece, and the protesters on the other side 6 years later. And they had re-hung the Egder Shufik, I Can See You banner during the protests. So at the same time that these protests were taking place, MoMA PS1 held a very large-scale exhibition, a building-wide exhibition called Theater of Operations, the Gulf Wars, 1991 to 2011. So this period was chosen to kind of the 1991 with the first invasion of Iraq, the Gulf War, not invasion, but the coalition war against Iraq in 1991, and then the American official end of the war, invasion and occupation in 2011. And I should note that I was involved in this exhibition. I offered, I offered some of my own understanding of the war, artists who had made work in, regarding the invasion, and some of the work prior to that, and my own, sort of research into Iraq and politics and its convergence with the arts. And I wrote an essay, contributed an essay for the catalog. So I wasn't involved in any of the selection of artists or anything like that, but I knew about the exhibition, contributed an essay, and also offered some of my own understandings to the curators involved in the show early on. As I noted, that was the extent of the involvement. I was not involved in the curating process, artists, how works were hung, what was used, anything like that. And I saw the exhibition for the first time on the opening day. And so when I went to the exhibition, I was there with several other artists. And at that point, we saw the exhibition itself. And I won't get into a reading of the actual exhibition necessarily, because I want to note that what was an interesting takeaway from this exhibition is actually how much of the Iraq wars were present in the kind of curatorial approach and in the experiences that several of the artists had. and in the governing structure of MoMA PS1 and MoMA itself. As I said, during the time of this exhibition that opened in November of 2019, the protests, these massive protests, were already underway in Iraq, and protesters were already, of course, being murdered, being assassinated. And of course, several of the artists in the show were Iraqi and had experiences in the occupation. One of those artists was Ali Ayal, who has had an exhibition here of one of his works, a very meaningful work, which has pillowcases where he's written dreams of several of his family members and friends, which was in response to one of his family members being killed during the war, and not wanting to do a portrait or an obituary, but rather writing the dreams of his family members on these pillowcases, and this is what was hung in the exhibition space. He came across during the exhibition this post, Instagram post from MoMA. MoMA PS1 is open on Veterans Day from noon to 6 p.m. Admission for veterans and all active duty military personnel is free today and every day. Visit Theater of Operations, the Gulf Wars, and investigate the impacts of 30 years of military engagement in Iraq on art and artists. So for an artist who has lived through the occupation, their experience, the MoMA didn't, what was clear is that they had no understanding that an artist might not want or should be consulted first before having their work as an advertisement for free admission for military, former American military that had been active in Iraq. So it's very hard to, I can't explain, it would be very difficult to describe all of the different extremely violent and traumatic ways that the American military occupied Iraq. But, very briefly, every home experienced a nighttime raid, a kind of almost SWAT-like operation where American soldiers were coming in at night, searching homes, patrolling the streets, speaking to people in many, for many people's experiences in really horrific ways. And obviously, occupying, putting into place an extremely violent occupation and control over the city and each person's lives. I would also note, this is after various massacres, including at Nisour Square, very well documented rape and murder of civilians, and the overall overarching violence that was implemented by soldiers that people on the ground had direct experiences with. They were not all in tanks and hidden away. These were face-to-face, person-to-person interactions. And so having this work advertised in this way was not, was very jarring, and also repeated a kind of trauma of doing this kind of a work and then having it used to advertise to military. So Ali made a work in response where the pillowcase that was hung, that was used for that, he created another one. And it basically talked about what it meant to have his work be used in this way. And as he says, he speaks about himself in this person. Ali told me the latest dream concerned the exhibition of the MoMA. I couldn't believe how it brought the texts and hung them at the MoMA, and then I ended up here. I couldn't believe that I didn't travel to the netherworld with this work. And it goes on, but he is basically saying that, what he's talking about is what it means to have that work be shown in this way, and the people who are responsible for this destruction and this destruction that is still ongoing, being able to be shown in this way. So he says how upsetting this dream was, that the artworks were getting destroyed I still remember watching the cotton and leathers burning while I was writing the dreams, a post on Instagram. So what he's talking about also is the work being destroyed through its use as an advertisement for military, the cotton burning, like seeing that the work in a way being destroyed through that act. So this was the first sort of situation that we were dealing with the exhibition. The second was I was informed by a colleague that the head of the MoMA, Leon Black, was a huge, has a huge hedge fund company, and that they had his company had acquired the mercenary group formerly known as Blackwater, and this was all, and several other paramilitary and mercenary groups, which were bundled under this name of Constellus Holdings. Blackwater, for those who aren't familiar with it, was one of the mercenary, military groups that private contracting military groups that had enjoyed very large contracts with the U.S. government and military, and which was involved in a very notorious case within the Nisour Square, where they basically released fire in a civilian square, and killed over 20 people, civilians who were driving, who were there at the time in the square. So Blackwater, because of all of this, sort of what is called bad publicity around that massacre, changed their name to Academy, but were still in operation. And this is one of the groups that was bought, along with a whole other set of private military groups, and bundled into that operate all over the world, but also in Iraq, and under this name of Constellus. So this ad was on Facebook during the time that we were in New York to see the exhibition. We were awarded 3 contracts in Iraq this week. We're looking for British nationals for October training and deployment in December. This is an entry-level contract for former military personnel, no prior experience in Iraq required. Ready for your next adventure. Email your CV and documents. So the head of the MoMA, the president of the board, owns this company. It's currently operating, and at the same time, apart from everything that these military groups, private military contractors are doing in many different parts of the world, on the ground in Iraq at the time is this massive protest where several of the artists, Ali Iyal, and I will speak now about Ali Yas, all of us knew people who were involved in it and had a sense of serious, solidarity doesn't express it necessarily, but with the people that are protesting, so many of which are young people, so many of which are being killed in the street, and being killed by private military, state military, paramilitary, at the same time that this is going on. So we spoke to the curators at the MoMA, several of us, about our issues with the fact that the chair of the board, president of the board, owned this company and was profiting off of these directly profiting off of these militaries operating in Iraq and elsewhere. We were basically told that MoMA and MoMA PS1 are 2 very different entities. They don't share a fiscal relationship. They don't have this kind of structure that is involved with one another. This was not the case. If you can even just go on MoMA's website and it's very clear. MoMA and MoMA PS1 share many, many resources. Their tax filings are together. We also, Leon Black's son is on the board of MoMA PS1. Leon Black is the chair of MoMA. These are very much symbiotic organizations that have very, very close ties to one another. So it was not just disappointing that we were being told that there wasn't a relationship there, but also very concerning that several artists who wanted to protest through their work in the exhibition space while the exhibition was taking place to bring awareness to these private military contractors and to what was happening on the ground in Iraq at the same time as this exhibition, which is purportedly about Iraq as a theater of operations. The title of the exhibition was absolutely not going to be allowed to take place. So this was a kind of firm reaction by the curators, I assume on behalf of the institution itself. This is just some of the mercenary groups or private military companies that are involved, that are under Constellus Holdings. And I should add, Leon Black as the chair also, through with the billions that he has given, tens of millions of dollars to the MoMA. So there are just numerous ties here, but the companies Triple Canopy, AMK9, Olive Group, Omniplex, TDI, all of these as one Constellus. This is the bundling all of these military groups. And so before I get to this, Ali Yas, who was an artist in the exhibition, young artist living in Berlin, had left Iraq when he was younger, and had made work that was in the show of drawings that were based on childhood drawings of home and leaving. Had lived as a refugee in Amman, Jordan, and was in Berlin at the time, unable to travel also because he was not a citizen. And so Ali, who was very much active around the fact that this was happening, and this was the lead of the MoMA and MoMA PS1, wanted to protest this. Protest the involvement of a person who owned Blackwater and these other military corporations at the museum, and also to protest the fact that there was this attempt to silence discussion around the critique of the institution itself. Of course, in the States and elsewhere, there has been a long history of institutional critique, which has been celebrated by the MoMA, accepted in many different ways, sort of celebrated this idea that the MoMA, and particularly MoMA PS1, is a radical space for contemporary art and for protest and for discussion of what is happening in the world today. But when Ali Yas just wanted to plan and hold a protest in the exhibition space using his own work, this was deemed a major threat to the museum. He planned a protest with students and faculty, several members at the New School for Social Research in New York, along with others who were involved in some of the protest movements that they've helped, or some of these members have helped organize. And it was set for the last day of the exhibition's run. And the idea of the protest was that he had organized with several of these members, because he couldn't be in New York, he had to be in Berlin, again, because he's not able to travel, for them to go into the space and to take his drawings and to tear at the edges. Again, similarly to Ali Iyal, this idea that the work cannot exist within this kind of a structure, that it changes the work, it changes the nature of the work and their own participation in it. The morning of the planned protest, the last day of the exhibition, Ali's work was taken down without his permission, without any previous discussion by him. The protesters, several dozen protesters, went to MoMA PS1, and the NYPD was called into the space. I should note that the protesters are extremely organized, have legal observers, have done this many times before, absolutely no violence whatsoever in their protest. But just going in, these are because the work was taken down without knowledge or discussion previously. They reproduced the images because Ali got an email informing him that the work was taken down. So he sent, printouts of his work so that the protesters could tear at those images. For the NYPD to be called in is extremely rare for a museum to do that, particularly for a protest that is fully peaceful and has their own legal observers accompanying them, and was not only indicative of how much the museum wanted to silence any critique of its institution, of its board, of where it got its funding from, but how threatened they were by a young Iraqi artist, male artist, having this kind of agency in the space. And the NYPD presence being there, a number of people noted, was so indicative, was so reminiscent also of the kind of war on terror policies that were very visible in New York at the time, with this idea that any brown man was suspect, that there's this like overwhelming police and state police force whenever there is some sense that this could be seen, this will be described as a kind of terror attack. And it was by the museum, where they released a statement saying that they, under no circumstances, will allow aggression or violence or destruction inside of the museum. So Ali's extremely peaceful and organized and very much within his right act of peaceful protest within the museum was attributed by the museum or characterized by the museum using the words violent, aggressive, destructive, and bringing in the police to something like this, with police cars surrounding the museum. So this is how the MoMA PS1 exhibition ended. This was the last day of the exhibition. And this is also why I note that there was this kind of really interesting parallel of the museum with the kind of tactics of theater of operations in and of itself, this sort of real lack of space for critique, for Iraqi voices, for people who were discussing and protesting what was taking place at the time, and having this be so visible on the closing day of the museum. Was there a question at all, or I thought I said, yeah.
No, somebody's leaving your.
Okay.
They're just thanking, yeah.
And this is just a picture of the where Ali's work was, and the museum's putting up the note. This work is not currently on view. So you have this empty space on the last day where Ali's images were previously. And I just want to note the biography that Ali has on the wall, that they have on the wall, born in Baghdad in the 1990s during the height of Western imposed trade sanctions, and now based in Berlin. Ali Yas's life and work has been defined by the circumstances of the wars in Iraq. Yas works primarily in filmmaking. However, in this series of works on paper, he attempts to remake his childhood drawings, which were lost after he was forced to leave Iraq in the wake of the 2003 war. So again, there is clearly there is like a very interesting or there's a very visible kind of barrier of the museum to recognize the experiences that they have on their wall when it is not just writing, but an actual, action and thought and political position that an artist is taking apart from what their label wants to contain. So I wrote a piece with Mustafa Hedaya about what took place at MoMA PS1, and one of the curators of the exhibition, it was curated by Peter Lili and Ruba Katrib. Ruba Katrib wrote a response in the Iraq Contemporary Studies Journal basically in response to the reception of the exhibition, and touching on slightly on the protests, but never actually addressing anywhere in this very extensive essay what the protests were protesting. So there is no mention of Leon Black or the power structure at the museum or the investment in Constellas, Blackwater, etc. That was nowhere to be found in the essay. And I wanted to pull this quote from it because it will relate to the Berlin Biennale that we experienced several years later, charting divergent art histories that had become intrinsically linked through geopolitical conflict. Theater of operations opened a recent colonial wound and became a platform for various actors, but it failed to begin a healing process, undoubtedly because it was still located and entrenched in empire. The Western regime of representation dominated the discourse around the exhibition as formulated through American identity politics and sensationalized media takes. So this use of the colonial wound and language around the colonial wound is quite striking. It is also used by the curator Kader Attia in response to our position against the use of Abu Ghraib images. And most interestingly, is used against in an attempt to be in opposition to the Iraqi artists that are protesting the way that the curators and the museum are involved in Iraq. And so, you know, here it failed to begin a healing process because it was located and entrenched in empire. This is also used, you know, because this, I guess, because it was in New York City. That was, you know, of course, not the case whatsoever. The issue is that it was located in empire in the sense that there would be no possibility for protest or pushing back against powers or involvement by people who are murdering and making life, you know, and destroying life in Iraq. And with the people who are most invested in it, whom are Iraqis themselves. The Western regime of representation dominated the discourse on the exhibition. However, obviously, Ali Yas and Ali Iyal were both pushing back against this regime of representation and who is allowed to have a voice in it and who is not, which was imposed by the museum itself, located, of course, in New York City. So it's interesting this way that there is a kind of the museum and the curator is attempting to use colonial violence as a scapegoat for colonial violence, you know, for this violence by the museum. And by the curatorial approach itself, which is not allowing, which refuses to allow for a kind of critique within the exhibition itself. Undoubtedly, this is also, maybe, I won't say undoubtedly, maybe this isn't the case, but I would argue that here as employees of the museum and later in Berlin as employees of the institution itself of the Biennale, there is an entrenched interest in needing to serve and to be not, this is what part of what I mean by plausible culpability, you know, this kind of idea that there is, it's not the fault of the curatorial process. It is not the fault of the institution. It's actually, the issue is the wound itself, and that it is so difficult to work within it because in a way it is saying that Iraqis are so wounded and damaged, and the issue is just impossible to resolve. And blaming the West in a way, whatever the West might mean, even as these actors are employees and citizens and residents and institutional actors of these sort of places, huge geographies that they are then calling the West. So this also begs this kind of questioning of terminology. What we decide the West is, whose wound is it? What do those words actually mean? What is a colonial wound? What does it mean to have a colonial wound? to whom is that attributed, and to whom is the sort of, who asked for the repair and in which way. Because in both situations, we see these curators kind of lamenting this absence of resolution for the wound or repair for this wound, when supposedly, this wound was not taking place necessarily in Berlin or in New York City, but in Iraq and with Iraqis themselves, who are the main actors in these oppositions. So I'll then go into the Berlin Biennale. So the MoMA PS1 show was in 2019. In 2022, a year before the opening of the Berlin Biennale, I was also involved. I contributed, volunteered an extensive amount of information on artists, artworks, the context of making work, and several artists that I had shared and works were eventually in the Berlin Biennale, were exhibited as part of the Berlin Biennale. Artists whom we had worked together in Iraq. One of those was Sajjad Abbas, whose eye we saw earlier. Another artist, Laith Karim, who was also made an incredible video as a teenager in Baghdad that took place in a car, in a vehicle, and spoke to the kind of extreme stress and difficulty of witnessing so much death through cars, through car bombings, through the kinds of targeting of people when they were out in the city. And he, through this video, provided a space for neighbors, friends, family to talk about this inside of an actual car, in a central space. And this video was also included, and then also a painting by Ra'ed Motar, which was a very physical painting of him and a friend of his who was, he's wearing a surgical mask, and he's sort of being fed with the IV by his friend who was with him. All three works very physical, very much highlighting, in Ra'ed's painting, they have bare torsos, they're in real proximity to one another. There's this like very close shared sense of a relationship and support between the two of them. In Sajjad's piece, there's a video of him climbing the wall to put up the installation. And in Laith's piece, and there's people of all ages, children, older women and men, and him and his friends. So there is also very present male physicality in each of those three works that were selected by the Berlin Biennale to be shown in the space. And so, I should describe a bit the show itself before going into the reasons that the artist and myself withdrew from the Biennale, but going in for the first time to the space, the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, and the kind of excitement that we had to see the work there, because all three works are so strong and so and very much deserve to be seen and to be understood in their own right. But going to see that work and then adjacent to it, and intersecting actually with Sajjad Abbas's eye in video, we discovered, again, I had been speaking with the Biennale for a year prior, and there was never any discussion of this work that would be in the show or exhibited, and bisecting one of the artists' work. So going there with the artists, and with several other young Iraqis who were in Berlin at the time, who had to immigrate, forced to immigrate there, or had to because of the wars, walking in and then going through the doorway and being met with floor-to-ceiling images from Tortured Abu Ghraib. For those who haven't seen the images, which were released in 2004, they were images of Iraqi men being sexually assaulted, piled naked in huge piles, one on top of the other, with dogs, American war dogs, at their feet, at their genitals, with being hung, bodies hung and exposed. And so you are walking through and you are literally at eye level with all of this. And it was not the images as you might have seen in the newspaper, but actually blown up to full size, larger than you are walking through the space. And this was set up in a maze, a kind of labyrinth, in a large room, where you would turn one corner, you couldn't go back, you would have to go back through and into the exit. So there was seeing that for the first time, it was obviously very disturbing, also because no one could understand how it was a work, because it was literally just reproduced images, interspersed with a couple of also reproduced images of like villages in Iraq being blown up. So there was a kind of confusion about why it was a work, but also how it was, why it was right there. And so this sort of, you know, when you're in an exhibition like this, you're looking forward to seeing the work, and then sort of realizing that I bring up the physicality of their own work, which was done as a kind of resistance and a working through of the occupation, because it became very clear that that was being used as a way to show the absolute torture and rape of Iraqi men who were exposed in a very different way. And obviously not in a kind of resistance, but as like a brutal view of what of the occupation's power, and of turning Iraqis, particularly Iraqi male body, like the people, into torture subjects, torture and rape subjects. So this, we immediately understood that we could not be in the same space as this work, because in one way there was a very clear way that having our work next to that work gave the impression that we were okay with it and had sort of given a tacit approval. I can only explain the lack of critical mass around this, sort of questioning around this piece as some confusion, because maybe seeing these works of Iraqis in the show in such proximity gave the impression that there was a kind of acceptance of that work. So we wanted to, ensure that there was no question, that there was no acceptance of those images being shown in the way that they were shown. And secondly, so we had immediately sort of spoken to the curators about moving the work. Eventually, it became clear that the work there were all kinds of reasons which did not really make sense to us of why the work couldn't be moved for a long period of time. At the same time, we had made a film for Documenta, and so we had to leave to Kassel. We went there, we came back after 2 weeks, and nothing had been changed with the pieces of work. They were still in the same spot. And so we had a number of conversations with the institution, and unfortunately, it was a somewhat similar experience as I had in the years before, where there was this calling of, understanding that we are angry and emotional and upset, without really a recognition of the kind of violence of reproducing the images in this way. And I should add that, for those who haven't seen it, having images of sexual assault survivors and rape survivors without their consent, I believe is like an issue that is present in this piece. Also because this was not, these debates have been taking place in journalism since it began, for hundreds of years. But for 100 years, since the early 19th century. But here, this was not a matter of the public's right to know American crimes in Iraq. This is an authored piece. The piece is by Labelle. It is authored by an artist and in an extremely prestigious international art event. And so there is a different kind of attribution of the images and a different context for the images that needs to be taken more seriously. And in this vein, so several of our objections, one being that rape and torture survivors have a right, when something is being used as an authored artwork, to give their consent for that, particularly as not all of the people in those images are dead. There are people in the images that are still alive. One of those victims lives in Germany. Even if they didn't live in Berlin and wouldn't come across it personally, it still is a question of consent, and attempting to have consent, which Labelle, later had said that in an interview, that he doesn't have to ask for permission. He doesn't. These pictures are available. They're on many, many, many sites, and have proliferated on really disturbing sites as well. And there is part of a whole library of rape and torture pornography that particularly that it was used in after the emergence of the videos. But at any rate, this was one aspect of using those images in this way without any kind of consent, and saying that you are the author of it, you are the author of this work. The second was the issue of the proximity to the work and the lack of consent for the artists involved to be in this kind of relationship with the piece, and to disconnect Sajjad's piece with this work as well, and what that will do to an artwork that is being shown. So we had extensive questions and critiques of this that we tried to express, or did express numerous times in several of these meetings, but unfortunately it became apparent that this was not really going anywhere. And again, this attribution of characteristics like angry and emotional, we did not feel that we could continue in good faith with that kind of approach to a very to very serious and grounded critiques. So we did finally write a public letter in art form that was published to discuss what the issues were with the piece. And we felt that was also necessary because there hadn't been a strong critique of the work. Several reviewers had mentioned it, said that it was, disturbing, not in good taste, etc., but had not fully discussed the violence and the nature of using this as an authored artwork, without any consent or discussion with those who were involved, or family members whose loved ones, or who themselves were involved in these crimes. I should also note, and it doesn't matter, even if they had been guilty of anything, no one deserves torture and what happened to these people. But the house-to-house raids that I discussed at the earlier, that is how the vast majority of men were taken to Abu Ghraib. It has come out in investigations that nearly all, by their own accounting, 99% of the men who were taken to Abu Ghraib were taken on false evidence or no evidence at all, and rounded up during many of these home raids and taken to the prison, and tortured and raped and murdered in many cases in this way. So we're also talking about unlawfully imprisoned men taken from their homes in front of their families and loved ones, and tortured in this way, and then again being used for a Biennale in Berlin. So at any rate, when this wasn't taken as seriously as we felt it deserved, we understood through the response of the team to our letter that we had no choice but to withdraw. And I include this quote that is from the Washington. David Brooks was one of the major American proponents of the invasion of Iraq. He's a very well-known writer. He writes for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and was a very prominent voice, and wrote this about the invasion when it started to not be as quote unquote successful as the first war. And people were starting to question why we were in Iraq. Most people nurture the facts that confirm their worldview, and ignore, pass over the ones that don't, unable to achieve enough emotional detachment from their political passions to see the world as it really is. I thought that was really interesting because of the way that I thought that was very interesting in relation to the way that the curatorial team, Kader Atia and the curatorial team, described our position as well. This is a quote from their response. "While we understand the emotion aroused in you by the use of the images in Jean-Jacques Lebel's work and respect it, allow us to propose another angle, if it is of distance in another context." And basically says, if it is difficult for you to accept this because of the proximity between your own wounded history and the subjects represented, at least acknowledge that other forms of reading are possible in order to claim reparation. So again, we have this conjuring of the wound, the colonial wound, and the lack of ability to have a kind of reparation because of the wound, which again places the blame on those who have the wound, who've experienced the issue or have are questioning it, and puts this kind of vulnerable emotional nature on those who have a clear critique and one that is again grounded and very serious, and places it as a kind of emotional reaction rather than one that is attempting to critically look at the use of images used by people who have experienced torture and rape through state violence, and how those images are used, and questioning if it is actually okay for an artist to use that work and use those images and say that it is artwork that they have made that is being exhibited in this way, which furthers one's standing, their career, whatever it may be. Then there is the second quote, recontextualizing an exhibition with other artworks. There's this attempt to say it slows down the time of attention to resist the amnesiac spread of our information society, and saying that art exhibitions are undoubtedly the last spaces for individual and collective experience of reality. This was told to us a number of times, that art exhibitions kind of slow time down so that we can experience images in a different way. From a very practical standpoint, when I was in that room, people could not get out of that room fast enough. But also, I think it is quite, there's no reason why the white walls, the white cube, necessarily is a different space for understanding than the many papers and research and investigations that have come out regarding torture at Abu Ghraib or anywhere else, that these sort of debates and questions have come up. So there is also this question of what it means to have these images, to show these images, the rights of victims or people who have gone through this, and this question of who is reparations for. Is it for the German viewer or the non-Iraqi viewer that goes into the space? Or is it for Iraqis themselves? It's not for, it clearly isn't, because there is this sense that, or there is this statement that because we are emotionally connected, we cannot have the repair happen or the reparation take place. So then this question becomes, who is it for? And I think that is the question, that's the question also at the MoMA PS1 exhibition. Who is this repair and reparations for? It seems to be for a museum audience, for curators and teams, for institutions, and for non-Iraqis to be able to go in and to feel that they have somehow done something or had some sort of performative repair done for a war that they have not experienced the same way that the people on their walls have experienced. So that was, those were some issues that came up in both of these. And what has been really informative and interesting is how the responses have been quite similar. You know, one thing I failed to mention at the start is that a lot of the contemporary art exhibitions, particularly these larger exhibitions, have come about, you know, after 91, and particularly 9/11 and with the war on terror. So the invasion and occupation and destruction of so much of Iraq's infrastructure and capacity was an incredible boom for capital in the Gulf states and in the region. So you have the first, you know, Christie's auction, for example, in 2006, which came up which was in no small part because of one of the 3 historic oil booms that took place in the Gulf, because Iraqi oil production slowed during the invasion, and because the demand, because of how much war necessitates fuel and oil, there was such a surge in pricing. And so you have, and also the logistical infrastructure of the Gulf, building bases, building, you know, the different military and contractors, and all of this was a construction boom for the Gulf states. And a capital boom for all that were involved, which is a coalition of nations. And so you have this huge increase in arts funding for, you know, contemporary art and initiatives with Middle Eastern artworks and exhibitions due to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And that is also one piece of how this violence circulates and how it is seen in exhibitions, even ones that don't necessarily, you know, that aren't, you know, formally situated on Iraq or on the war specifically. And I just bring that up because there's that sort of piece of art history is not so often discussed, but is a really, I think, a really critical facet. That mimics also this idea of the red zone and green zone. There are all of these spaces around where the violence is happening that are much smaller actually in size and in terms of the populations that are affected, but are deemed to be safe and to reap these rewards. And then these much larger populations and people that are affected who are in the red, sort of too dangerous, too aggressive, too emotional, and too unworthy of having the kind of, you know, basic rights or abilities, whether it's to critique an exhibition or to live in any kind of, you know, stability. You know, that is where these populations are compartmentalized in. And I think, and that becomes very visible in the responses. And also, you know, in this like kind of micro level, in this, you know, in what is a very tiny world, you know, this kind of art world that we're talking about, but is rooted in, particularly financially rooted in, this massive infrastructure of military and spending. I think I will end there. Thank you for your patience, and if there's any questions at all, happy to discuss any of this further.
Thank you, Rijin. I think there is a comment or rhetorical question. Thank you for this informative presentation. It's striking to me how capital is so imbricated in the art world and yet reproduces the violences it claims to repair. Is there accountability for capital?
No, obviously not. I mean, I think that's what is, you know, that is what is so, I think that is what this, such resistance that these institutions had. It's this demand for accountability is so threatening that the reactions were so extreme. I mean, we were very surprised by the extreme nature of the reactions, you know, as well, that, you know, having a kind of viewpoint or, you know, bringing up an issue like this would be so, that there would be such this like kind of wall put down around any discussion of it. I think that's part of it. It's part of this fear around accountability. It's why all of these protests, not only in Iraq but around the world, have been met with such ferocious response and brutal response. Because accountability towards it is so there's so much to lose if that starts to crumble.
Is there any other questions from other participants?
There is a remark in the comment section.
Yeah, I already read that one. Yeah. I have a question that you don't have to answer. I realize you're emphasizing the male body specifically, that there is also something there, like not only about the Berlin Biennale, but also you mentioned it earlier in the presentation, like emphasizing male artists or male bodies. So I was curious, like, if you want to reflect on it a little bit more.
I think it was very I think because it was so, well, I guess also with Iraq, there has been, it was a kind of strategy for the coalition to make visible so much murder of men. So during the invasion, there were these also mass graves and roundups, and you would see so many men being killed. And this is also present in America. This is like also a tradition in America, a really sordid tradition with Black men, where you see the videos of police violence or brutality, and it's looped over and over and over again. And there's been some really critical writing about what it means to watch these videos over and over again and for no change to take place. But this has a long legacy in America as well, from postcards of lynchings, and this kind of visible display of power where these are collectible items, and the images from Abu Ghraib were collectibles. They were on soldiers' servers, and they were, sent to friends and lovers and family as this kind of conquest, or this kind of postcard from Iraq. And so, there's a kind of, obviously, like a power and domination and violence that is very present in this. And I think one where it was acceptable. And I touched on this in the letter that, I asked this question because in the Taguba report, the military investigation of what happened at Abu Ghraib, the investigator notes that there is evidence that women and children were raped at Abu Ghraib. And those images were not the images that were released to the public. And I questioned this touched on this in the letter, which was, if those images were available, would they have been shown? Would that have been okay to blow up and put into a piece? And they were not shown in the States, I believe, because it would have turned from something where we understand that Arab and Iraqi men are animals, and this reinforces the fact that they are animal. They're at the level of the dogs that we use in the war. And there has been so much anti-Arab and anti-Iraqi sentiment that has been established in the States from the 70s on and through the first Iraq war, that it was shocking, but it didn't change the course of the war. It didn't change anything. It made people a bit horrified, some people, but there were senators that called it, kind of like a soldiers, this happens, war is ugly, blah, 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 like this kind of dismissal of it. If there were images of women or children being raped or tortured this way, I believe it would have turned things, because it would have gone from they're subhuman anyway to, oh, but we don't do this to women and children. you know, then there would have been actual calls for accountability, or for an end to the war, or for something so horrible that we couldn't actually accept it, or say it was kind of, you know, it's kind of disgusting, but it's not going to, it's not, they haven't crossed a real line here. So, because there is always this debate of, was torture okay? If it's terror, you know, if these people are terrorists, can we use torture? But, you know, against women and children, this is a very different question that people ask themselves. So I don't think that the Berlin Biennale would have been open to showing those images if they actually got the pictures, those pictures. And I don't think the pictures of Abu Ghraib would have been leaked, because they weren't, if it was of those images. And there is documentation of that, but I don't think it will ever be released. And so that is also part of this idea of, and this has also been, you know, this is also something that people have written about, the sense of what it means for why, you know, women and children in one category and men in another. And I think it's this acceptance that happens when it's men, you know, because they've already been, it's kind of fair game in a way, in a different, and with a different kind of, there's a different consciousness, I think, or giving of consciousness, you know, for if it's a woman that's happening to, then it's a crime in a way, you know, as opposed to with the men that were used. And I bring up the, you know, the male physicality also because it's so present in Sajjad and Ali, Sajjad and Ra'id and Laith's pieces, you know, and so it was also a very difficult thing to see their physicality, which is part of a their work was part of a resistance and working through of the invasion, and that being used with the kind of with those other images, you know. So it's like all of this that we're working to resist is then being used for a tool of the occupation, which the Abu Ghraib images absolutely were. You know, there's also something that came up with the curators, that we have to show the crime. That was like repeated, this chorus that we have to show the crime. And we repeatedly said, everyone has seen the crime. These were the most notorious images from the war. This is what people remember from Iraq, is those images. You know, this was on every single newspaper, in every single newspaper. But this doesn't serve the, and so it was also a sort of fallacious argument, you know, that we have to see the crime as if we hadn't seen it before, you know. But I think there's this question too, why do we have to, what does it mean to see the crime in a white cube? How does it make it any different, you know, or what is that? Why is that supposedly bringing another kind of, is it value? Because there is value in those white walls, obviously. There is capital in those, there is value, like actual currency, you know, that takes place in those walls. And you can't separate the fact that showing at the Berlin Biennale is going to increase your value. You know, Labelle's are at the end of the line, he's in his 80s, you know, and I actually don't care so much about Labelle. You know, a lot of people ask me, I can't believe this old white French guy was able to make this work, but it doesn't matter. Like for this issue, I don't think the issue is that Labelle is French or a man. I think the issue is that there was a choice to put this work in the show, you know, and to defend it and to place it with those works, with the work of Sajjad and Ra'id and Laith. And that's really the question. You know, we never asked for that work to be taken down because it was clear that there would be a whole censorship debate, which we were not interested in having, you know. So that is I think that was a whole question that came up that I don't think is worth I don't think stands up to the question of using rape and torture victims without their consent and making it a piece that can be attributed to one person and then put into a exhibition of that scale. But that's why the focus on the male kind of men.
Thank you.
Jane, and thank you, Kirk. I wish you had put a disclaimer because it was quite triggering. and almost suffocated at certain points. And I thought, why I feel suffocated? And some of it got to do with Zainos, just recent response. But I should say that this presentation made me feel suffocated at the moments when you just read the replies from those curators into incidents. You know, it almost feel like hitting the wall. So in order to further the discussion, I would like to ask a bit with regards to your practice, Rijin, because you use writing and teaching. And I just briefly read your article at Arts Forum, that recent one involving all those responses, and just, you know, watching this presentation, which involves totally positionality, self-awareness, reflective practice, and much, but I haven't seen in any of those replies any kind of self-reflexivity. So these are the curators, but they kind of use the jargon or the scholarship that we refer to. They say wound, we say maybe care and repair. So these are, let's say, our scholarly assets or the conversation and discourses going on when, and in a way, we communicate in English. So this is our, you know, common base. So I am really curious about, you know, what you think. I mean, first of all, do you feel like you hit the wall like I do? Because, you know, based on my also some of my own experiences. And then how do you really think about then what are the other possibilities of furthering this dialogue? Because obviously you or the artists used nonviolence communication, you know, communication-based peaceful protests. You know, so we are so caring. I mean, we meaning I really would like to empathize with your practice and the way the jargon, the language you use. We do care. We come with empathy. But how will we, you know, form that ground, you know, to reach a common ground, let's say. But I'm not really expecting a common ground, but at least a possibility of communication, which is not obviously rising out of it, but on the contrary, we hear lots of defense. So what do you think about it? Thank you.
You know, a commonality with those that were in, like, with the curators or with the people that we're working with or needing to work with. Well, yeah, I would say, of course, it's incredibly frustrating. It was, you know, it was very sad, I think, is what it was, like, very, you know, they kept saying that we were angry, but it was actually very heartbreaking to go and to be with, we were there for the first time together after many years apart in Berlin. And there was this, you know, there were friends, some of the artists had friends from Baghdad who had made it to Germany, and we were together, they were together also for the first time. So to go through and then, and they're all, you know, young, like in their 20s, and there was this excitement, and then to go in and to see the pictures and just be confronted with that, it was very, very sad, I would say. We weren't angry, it was just very sad. So I think that's where most of our feeling came from. Of course, there's frustration and all of that, but I think more than that, it's like why do, you know, sort of this, why does this keep happening? And why is there this overwhelming, this violence with Iraq that feels very never ending and in every corner, you know, and even with places and entities, or, you know, that you think you can trust, or that maybe will do things the right way this time, you know, this kind of hope that then gets attacked, you know, in a really confrontational and, like, kind of merciless way, you know. So I think that part of it is really hard for all of us, you know. It was hard, but being part of the writing the piece and withdrawing, and, like, the support that we received, actually not from people in the exhibition, but from so many people outside of it, I think was so important, not just for me, but actually for the artists that were involved, because there was this way of making their experience known and seeing that it was heard, and that there were, 500 people signed on to that letter once it became public, and being able to take some control over that situation, and to have a voice in it, which is something that the occupation has really tried so hard to take away from Iraqis, and what these exhibitions tried to do. So that process of the letter and withdrawal and working together, and with so many other people who became involved, it changed the experience. It was still obviously a grotesque experience, but there was some power over what happened after, and some agency, and being able to say no. And saying we don't need this, and it's not worth it, and we can say it, and other people will see it, because I think this is also the central kind of heartbreak of Iraq, is feeling that 1 million people can die and no one cares, and they will still they'll even show this, like, these crimes in such a non-valuable way, in such a way that is so devaluing of that, our lives, and our families' lives. And so I think that is part of it, and part of SEDA. The whole point of SEDA too was like my own feeling that, I had worked in the States with artists, and I had curated a show about Iraq, and all of the artists were, because we couldn't get visas for Iraqis to come, they were all like diasporic artists. And, I'll say that I respected all of their work, but it wasn't the same as work that I wanted to support artists in Baghdad, because to me that is the center of everything, of the world's power, of these struggles, of, these global occupations are all happening here. Like, this is, everything is sort of centered there, apart from the fact that I know it, but there's a lot at stake. And so part of going there and working with the artists who are at the art school also came out of this also frustration at seeing that it was really what was being called, or, portrayed as contemporary art of the Middle East, or artists in the Middle East. They were all people who were not actually working in these cities, particularly in places like Iraq. They were people who had people, honestly, again, like me, who had multiple passports, who could go in and out, who were very mobile, who went to art school outside of those countries, all of that. And that's not to say that that's bad or not valuable, because it's all value, like, it's all can be really, really important work. And it's not my space to judge that or anything like that. It's about what I wanted to support as a person was work from people who experienced that city and the conditions in that city, and all of these, the context of Baghdad at the time, which, if you did go, and, I've gone at different periods for personal reasons also, but then going after the occupation, there is so much richness in a global struggle for control over land and resources that is present there, that it's just, it's impossible. It's almost impossible to describe, because it really is present in the city. And you realize how much is missing when that work isn't supported. The work from artists who are actually living there and experiencing that and seeing all of it, and have access to all of that material and work, and what they're witnessing. It's very different than work from a distance, and it's just different. If you're interested in, my interest was in mining and supporting the experience, what it is like to experience in this century that kind of struggle, and that kind of vying for messaging, texts, how, narrative, technology, all of that is really born there. This is a whole other conversation, but all of the technology that we have established now as our lives took place through research in Iraq. Like the first Gulf War was played on a 2-player game, the first multiplayer game. That was done to simulate the Iraq War before it started. A lot of the biometrics that we have now was taken by people in Iraq without their consent, and in Afghanistan. and the robotics of supposedly taking apart the IEDs, you know, all of that is used in a lot of the technology that we see now. So all of that is what is present and what we don't have an understanding of when we don't look at something that's happening there, but are just sort of looking at experiences from a distance or from our own memory. And again, not that isn't important or valuable, but it's a different kind of practice and it comes from a different place. And I think it's easier in a lot of ways to not, obviously it would have been easier not to go and to work with, you know, people who don't, you know, with students who have gone through a lot and who don't necessarily have access to the kinds of resources and theories and all of this that art students in other places would have. But what they do have access to is immeasurable and so specific. And I think that work, you know, we don't see a lot of that work because it's much harder to make work from that kind of a space and place. And that's a whole other conversation about who gets to make work and what becomes visible, you know, but that was what, you know, like Raed and Laith and Sajjad who are in the show, and there's so many other artists who just weren't in that show. You know, their work says, you know, this is like a small part of it, but if you actually went to the show and looked at the work side by side, you know, it's so clear what is what is in that work and what you get by saying you're making work about Iraq and just showing images of torture that were already released by every newspaper 20 years prior. You know, that's a very obvious difference. I don't know if I answered the question at all, but.
Thank you, Rijin. Maybe we can take a last question if you have any. If not,
or we can let Rijin
yeah.
go and rest. Thank you very much, Rijin.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
for giving us full 2 hours and answering all the questions. And it was an amazing presentation. Hope to see you soon.
Thank
Thank
Somewhere
you.
on Earth, yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.
Good evening or good afternoon, Rijin.
Right.
In the
Thank you for staying up.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.